Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manuel. He is Stefan Bienkowski. This is the main show. Match day 9. Stefan, how's it going, buddy?
Yeah, very well. Had a nice weekend. Definitely getting kind of stormy here. Crappy weather that time of year. I like it because the colors and the trees and the shrubbery and things like that. But it also means you often get nights like this, which are quite gloomy, very wet, very dark, windy. At least in my part of the world. A good time of year to be kind of stuck in the house watching football, I should say. So there's always every silver lining to every cloud, I suppose. How are you?
Yeah, good. Down south in Seattle for the weekend, and we do Halloween with our friends over here. Every year. We didn't do it last year because it was just around the time that Tay was born, but Tadeus's first Halloween. It was fun. We dressed up as Mario Brothers, and so Tadeus got to dress up as Toad, which I think actually worked out really well.
Yes, I can confirm. I've seen the photos. Pretty adorable.
Yeah, well, it's a great costume for like a baby, right? Because like all you have to do is stick a mushroom head on it, and that's about it.
Well, yeah, exactly. And they're none the wiser, so that's the great thing about having babies. You can put them in anything and they don't really care or know any better.
We went trick-or-treating with my buddy's boys. When Tadeus came along, he was sitting in his little buggy and a stroller, and it looked like he was driving a go-kart. It was the most hilarious thing ever. So yeah, we were quite pleased that it worked out. But yeah, Halloween is done and dusted. And so straight to Christmas season, I guess. Now, like, bring out the Lebkuchen and the Glühwein and all that sort of stuff. I have one more media trip. I will be in Berlin next weekend for Union against Bayern. But yeah, before we dive into that, of course, Champions League matches this week as well, right? So lots of stuff to look forward to. Big game to Paris against Bayern. I think that's the big test we're all waiting for. But yeah, we have lots to dive into, and I think we're going to break this down a little bit different. We're going to do this as a Q&A. We're going to touch on this match day, but we decided to give the listeners on the Substack a chance. And we made this open, so you didn't have to be just a subscriber. This was open for everyone. Give them a chance to ask some questions. And so we're going to break it all down. I think, Stefan, you have the questions curated. So like, if we didn't exactly answer your question, that's not because we don't like you or didn't like the question, but it's probably because someone else asked something similar. So we kind of put it all together and tried to theme it a little bit as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we've only got so much time as well. So we'll try to, we're trying our best to kind of get as much as we can. But I'll try and group them together. I think we should probably try and do it chronologically because we did get some questions on the Friday night game between Augsburg and Dortmund. The first question is from Gina, who says, "My heart cries out for Dortmund not scoring more goals. A dull 1-0 win." Not a question, a statement. So, maybe an interesting one to start with. But I think, Manu, a really kind of interesting point, and maybe something a lot of Dortmund fans, are probably wondering about this season because Dortmund haven't been scoring a lot of goals. This game obviously backs on the back of the Cologne game, where Dortmund kind of had to rely on a last-minute goal to, obviously pick up result in that game, and then, it's a single goal to beat Augsburg in this one. I guess we just start with that. I'll let you jump in first. What did you make of that performance? What have you made of Dortmund from an attacking point of view this season?
I mean, I've said this before. I think, unfortunately, Dortmund are not going to be that exciting to watch the next little while. I think that Niko Kovac only has one goal in mind, and that is to win football games. And I think coaches in the past have tried and failed spectacularly to install a exciting style of football, the same way than Jürgen Klopp did, right? Which was at the time very efficient because it was new, and it was exhilarating, and it brought a lot of joy and titles to Dortmund. And then every coach after tried to do the same thing and failed, including Edin Terzic on the final match day. So I think what Niko Kovac looked at is like he doesn't care about anything but results. It is something that ended his Bayern reign, right? Because there too, He tried to suffocate opponents. It wasn't always the prettiest football. And with Bayern Munich, you don't only have to win, but you also have to win in a nice way. And I think that's why, that cost him the job. That and the Champions League performances in particular against Liverpool, right? That were atrocious in some ways. But I think at Dortmund that this is going to work. I think that, the style of football is ultimately going to lead to title wins for Borussia Dortmund. And so I don't think Niko Kovac is going to take care about what people think. It's a little bit similar to what Arteta is doing at Arsenal at the moment, isn't it? Where the football isn't spectacular, but it's really just results oriented. And I think people in Dortmund are so fed up with like the next coach promising the sky without actually delivering, that they are, I think, quite accepting of this.
Yeah, I think that's probably an interesting way to look at it. You have to consider the context of what came before him. Not just Nuri Sahin, it's been for the longest time. I know Terzic was maybe a slight departure from this, but basically every head coach since Klopp was there has tried to play this kind of gegenpressive football, which has always been flawed in some form or another. And it's often ended in this kind of like car crash football where, Dortmund throw themselves forward. It could be entertaining, but they always end up slipping up in a banana skin. And I think Terzic kind of obviously changed that, which helped him get to Champions League final. And Kovac has obviously come in. Everyone knows what kind of football Kovac plays. He knows what style of football he likes to play. He has a clear coaching identity and ethos, and for the most part, it has worked. And I think there's maybe two reasons why, people like Gina are maybe quite bored of Dortmund this season. The first one is that they do play a very solid formation of football. They obviously try to minimise the amount of chances that they give away. That is Kovac's kind of priority in these football matches. And that works. You can't deny it. If you take penalties out of the equation, they've only conceded one more goal than Bayern Munich, who everyone was talking about as one of the best teams in Europe right now. Even if you include penalties, they're only 2 behind Bayern Munich. They're second in the Bundesliga for shots on target conceded. And it means they can go somewhere like Augsburg, who, okay, admittedly aren't fantastic, but even you can talk about Cologne as well prior to that. And they can kind of, and how many, and like they can rely rely on their own ability, to rely on their own system. And how many times have we said this season that Dortmund don't seem to panic like they used to in game? They seem to have this kind of reassurance about them. And I think that is built on that defensive stability. Now, that doesn't really negate the need to score goals, obviously. And I think a large part of that is due to the individual form of some players in that team. I think you can make a pretty clear case that Dortmund were over-reliant on Guirassy towards the end of last season and still are. And his form has certainly gone off a cliff this season. And Dortmund just do not have someone who can step in there. They've tried to play Julian Brandt in different positions. They've tried to play Maximilian Bayer up front instead of Guirassy, as we saw midweek in the cup game. And it hasn't really quite worked one way or another. They don't really have a number 9 in that team. Maybe Fabio Silva can do that, but he's a player who I think still has a lot to prove at this level, so I wouldn't really exactly be thinking, okay, great, we've got Silva, let's just throw him in for the rest of the season. And I think Kovac is trying to negotiate and navigate that as carefully as he can. He doesn't want to just drop Guirassy, he doesn't want to just kind of draw a line under his career at Dortmund and say, right, on to the next guy. Whether it's down to form, maybe he's got personal issues, maybe he's got fitness issues, maybe it could be anything really, or just the steady decline of his, it's just this is the point of his career where maybe he just starts to kind of steadily decline, perhaps, who knows. It's a case of, Dortmund maybe trying to, or Kovac trying to find solutions in real time, but crucially, he can do that because they can fall back on that defensive form. And I think that's how they can kind of grind out games against Augsburg. And I do think that match was, painful to watch and certainly wasn't entertaining football on a Friday night, but it was also the kind of result I'm just not used to Dortmund getting. It strikes me as a kind of game, it's the kind of result I'd expect someone like Bayern to pick up over the years, where they play terribly, don't particularly deserve to win, but they find some way to get a result. And for the most part, I'd say Dortmund are certainly still doing that this season. So it might not be entertaining, it might not be sexy, but it's still getting results, Manu, and they're still thereabouts towards the top of the table, aren't they?
No, I mean, Bayern had lots of games like that last year under Company. There was like Köln. Köln is a good example. Around this time of the year, I think they played them, and it was a very boring game of football. And I think, it was 1-1-0. And yeah, I think as Kovac is establishing a system there and is trying, in his own words, to make up the 25-point gap to Bayern Munich that they had last year, and saying like it's probably going to take more than 1 year to close that gap. I think this is very much about building a foundation. And, this is the problem that a lot of Bundesliga teams have, and you have touched on that in the past, is that a lot of teams kind of forego defending when it comes to building a foundation. And he's very much, I think, of the mind that defending has to be the number one priority. And then you can build the house on that, right? And so I think that is what he's doing. He's just getting the fundamentals right before he's building. Before he's putting in the walls and putting on the roof and all this other stuff, and then the chandeliers and all the fancy things that you need in the house. So I think that's kind of where Kovac is at, and I think for him it's boring. I'm not gonna lie, this is not great football, but it gets the results, and then I think it is building towards something that will lead to success.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then on the flip side, Aaron Johnson asks, how long can Augsburg afford to give Sandro Wagner?
Well, the question is how can they afford to fire him?
Yeah.
You know what I mean by that? It's like they made such a big deal out of this hire, and it was such a high profile get for them. And Sandro Wagner had options in Hoffenheim and in Wolfsburg, and I think Leverkusen talked about him, and Leipzig, all these teams. And when Augsburg ended up getting him, it was such a massive get, and it was such a departure from the club that they used to be this solid mid-table Bundesliga team, and they wanted to be more exciting. They wanted to integrate young players like Noah Kai Banks and Kömür and all these guys. And Sandro Wagner was a big part, or is a big part of that. I'm not talking about past tense yet. And so, I think the real question is can Augsburg afford at this stage to admit that they were wrong about the path that they were taking?
Yeah, I mean, I think you if you look at his performances recently, they've not been fantastic, but they've also had a tough run of it, obviously, in the Bundesliga. They've just played Dortmund, just played Leipzig. They got a draw away to Cologne. They beat Wolfsburg before that. There's maybe hints of maybe things starting to kind of gel together. It's also worth saying that Gina, the Dortmund fan who asked about Dortmund's poor form, commented underneath that saying she thought Augsburg actually put up a pretty good fight against Dortmund on Friday night, so that's quite encouraging. So I think it's a very important point. But if you look at who Augsburg have before the end of the year, they play Stuttgart. Okay, Stuttgart away, difficult, but then they play Haas-Vau and then Hoffenheim, a really bad Leverkusen side who we're about to come on and talk about, then Frankfurt, then Werder Bremen. So there's at least 3 games in there you would expect Augsburg to be fighting for all 3 points. And then I think after that run of games, you're probably thinking we either know where we're going with Sandro Wagner or it's time to cut our losses, because you then obviously get to the end of the first half of the season. And look, Augsburg aren't expected to be beating Dortmund, they're not expected to be beating Leipzig, but they should be taking points off Hoffenheim, they should be taking points off Haas-Vau, should be taking points off Werder Bremen. And if they can't do that, then I think we could probably say, okay, maybe things quite aren't working out for Sandro Wagner, especially after the guy who he replaced, as I keep saying, did a perfectly good job. But let's not jump back down that rabbit hole again, Manu. But yeah, that's the Dortmund-Augsburg game. Should we move on to another one?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, as you would imagine, we have a lot of questions about Bayern Munich. But before we go into that, Manu, we should probably touch on Leipzig, who beat Stuttgart. 2 questions stand out to me here, and maybe we can maybe join together. Greg asks, do you think RB Leipzig are a bigger threat to challenge for the Bundesliga than Dortmund? Yes, RB Leipzig are young and inexperienced, but they have a luxury of not having a grueling European schedule. And then Justin asks, how high is Jan Diomandé's ceiling? Manu saw the potential early, but do we think he'd be this good already? And not just attacking, but team play and defensive covering. So a lot of praise for Leipzig, obviously, after beating St Pauli, Stuttgart. You watched this game. What did you think of it?
Yeah, this game was a lot tighter than the score suggests. Alexander Nübel made a horrible mistake, and it's probably why he's never going to be a Bayern Munich goalkeeper. Yeah. In fact, I think he's actually not going to be a Stuttgart goalkeeper beyond this season. There's a young goalkeeper by the name Simon playing in the Zweite Bundesliga for Paderborn right now on loan from Stuttgart. And he is slated to be replacing Nübel. It's a real shame because Nübel had a great performance in this game and kept it very tight, and then gave it away. But to get to Leipzig,
isn't that just Nübel though?
yeah, no,
Perfectly summed
100%.
up.
But he's trying to play. He's trying to play like Neuer, but he can't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
This sounds really harsh, but that's the reality. And I think I always had really high hope for Nübel, but I've come to the reality now that I think his ceiling will be being a good goalkeeper in a top 5 league, which is fine. But you're not going to play for a top club that way. And I think Stuttgart are not going to pay the 20 million euros Bayern will ask at the end of the season, nor will they will be willing to pay his salary, especially if there's a younger, more promising talent coming up, right? So, you have to get the succession planning right, and you actually maybe play a guy whose contract you actually own. But yeah, I will have to say this game was a lot tighter than I suggested. And Stuttgart have been really good this season. I have praised them over the last few weeks, and I thought this was a game. This was Leipzig's first real test since they got smashed 6-0 by Bayern. And, without the Nübel mistake, they probably still win this game. So, I think they passed this test. And I think they played really well. I do think that they have a massive leg up over all their competitors in the top 4 by not playing in Europe. It gives Ole Werner the chance to play young players. It gives them the chance to rotate. But I also think that a lot of these young players, especially after getting smashed by Bayern Munich, have made significant steps forwards in their development. Uedraogo, he might be one of the best midfielders in Germany at the moment. He's looking fantastic, and I actually think he is ready to be called up. Diomande, I interviewed him a few weeks ago for Transfermarkt. Very, very nice kid with a very interesting past, right? With his development path and all that. Ended up going to Leganes in Spain and playing really well there. And then Leipzig scooped him up for 20 million euros out of nowhere. And a lot of people thought, oh, why are they spending that money? He leads the league in dribbles and one-on-one takes, right? And I the way he's playing in this game, the potential for me is endless. They have full control over his future. He's on a long-term contract. He's aggressive. He's fast. He's very good in creating chances for himself and his teammates. He is playing in a setup that really works for him. He's playing with a single number 9 in Romelu, who's really not, one of the big problems I think that they had 2 flashy number 9s before with Openda and Šeško. Romelu is very selfless. Like, he likes to play and make the players around him better. And yeah, I think this is a very dangerous Leipzig side. And, if Bayern slip up, I think they're right there. And I'd be curious to see how that return match against Bayern is going to turn out, because I think in the last 8 games since, this team has matured a lot. And come, I think, January, February, when they play each other in the return leg, Bayern will have had a lot more games in their legs. And that could be interesting. So I do actually think at the moment they might be more dangerous to Bayern than Dortmund.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the really interesting thing about Diomande is, as you said, you kind of look at the way he plays. He's outstanding with his dribbling, he's outstanding with his kind of chances or goal creation or getting to goal scoring opportunities. 2 things also stand out to me really well. He's also a very creative player. He's almost like a de facto kind of playmaker in a sense. He's not really kind of picking passes as a central midfielder, but just because he breaks the line so many times, he does kind of end up kind of either directly or indirectly creating chances for Leipzig. And that's the kind of thing I think we needed to kind of see get changed this season, in the sense that how many times did we spend last season saying, Leipzig are only as good as David Raum's left foot or as Xavi Simons' dribble and pass, and they were so relying on those 2 players. I know they had Šeško, but he wasn't a complete player, as we talked about. He still really relies on good service. Openda, will run through brick walls for you, but equally needs service. And as you said, the 2 of them often butted heads with one another in the box for much of last season. It feels like this Leipzig team are a far more balanced team. And as you also mentioned, and actually, as Justin mentioned in the question, Diomande is one of the best players in his position in the Bundesliga this season for interceptions, blocking shots. He's obviously a very eager 18-year-old player who wants to prove himself, and he's getting that opportunity to do that at Leipzig. And the interesting thing is, Manu, is that they've got so many kind of players in that team who do feel like they have to prove themselves. Whether it's Sival, Lukeba, Romelu, as you mentioned, Bakayoko, Nusa, who's only really just kind of getting an opportunity to kind of come into his team, Domande, Odrago, Banzuzi, another exciting young player.
Good player.
But then there's also guys like Bob Gardner, who suddenly is playing like the player we've always expected him to become. He's finally playing like this kind of leading Bundesliga kind of number 8 or number 10. So there's definitely a degree of depth in that team. It's a very balanced team. I think it's far more balanced than it was last season. I'd be really interested to see how they perform if someone like Romelu was to pick up an injury, especially in a centre forward position. But as the questions have alluded to, I think it was Greg who said that one. They do not have European football to contend with, so that's a huge thing. That's absolutely a humongous thing. But it will kind of come down to whether they can kind of make sure that consistency kind of doesn't, or inconsistency doesn't kind of creep into their performances, and they don't start dropping points. So when they get to that point to play Bayern again, they are kind of within touching distance and maybe can do something to hurt them. But we'll have to wait and see. I'm still, as much as they have been good attacking, I do kind of feel like they have still kind of got issues defensively a wee bit. I'm still not convinced by, for example, Galassi. I don't think he's, a world-class goalkeeper. I still think Willy Orban isn't the player he once was. And that Leipzig team's now 32. Baku at right-backs, decent, but obviously not top level in my opinion. I know these guys are all doing a decent job for Leipzig this season, but I'm talking about when they come up against the Bayern or Dortmund. That's where they'll have to play. But Stuttgart have been great. They're also one of the best defensive teams in the league, funnily enough. I guess it helps when, defensive midfield or a central defender scores on goal and then the goalkeeper kind of passes the ball for the goal, the winning goals. I understand that might be a bizarre statement to say after that performance, but I think that's because Leipzig put that pressure on, because Leipzig have that quality to kind of really unsettle what has been a very settled and very good defensive Stuttgart teams. Yeah, I think Manu, they'll absolutely be up there. It'll be between them and Dortmund, I would imagine, at this point for that second spot. And maybe one of them can obviously, for a bit of luck, can maybe challenge Bayern in the second half of the season. So this moment in time is looking like a big ask, isn't it?
Yeah. The question is Bayern ever going to lose another game again? Or even drop points at this stage, right?
Yeah, well, we do have a lot of questions about Bayern and one or two about Leverkusen. Before we do, though, I want to touch on this one. Serena has asked a quick question about St Pauli, which we probably do have to touch on. They lost again this weekend.
Yeah.
She asked what is going wrong at St Pauli. We touched on it last episode. Obviously, for anyone who's not paying attention, St Pauli lost against Gladbach at the weekend there, 4-0. Which is significant for two reasons, because the first one is that Gladbach are absolutely pants at this moment in time, which is a significant win for them and for Polanski, obviously, as the interim head coach, who's looking to kind of keep that job. But it's now the 6th successive Bundesliga defeat for them. Manu, it's an interesting question because obviously they are kind of in free fall at the moment, but there's also something quite funny happened in the post-match press conference when the St. Pauli head coach walked in. Bless him, sorry, I forgot his name there. He sat down to answer questions and the power turned off. Then flicked back on a few moments later, but he was, football is all about like the kind of omens and, all these things. And he was like, oh God, that doesn't really help. And sure enough, I was reading the Kicker kind of opinion piece on what's going wrong at St. Pauli, and that was the top line. Oh gosh, how can Blessing turn the lights back on for St. Pauli?
Oh my God.
And unfortunately, that is the kind of cliches that we sports writers trade in. We can't really help it. But yeah, St. Pauli, absolute mess. What's going wrong? I've got a few opinions on this, but I'll let you jump in if you want to go first.
Well, there's a few things going on, right? Like the whole Jackson Irvine thing off the pitch, the controversy surrounding him. Goes back to him wearing a pro-Palestine shirt and the St. Pauli fan base. Obviously, it's a complicated topic. I don't want to dive too deep into it, but a big part of St. Pauli fan base because of Germany's past. felt that was complicated. And I think that is something that is really hurting the club, because Irvine is such an important player for them, and a leader off the pitch and on the pitch. And I think there's also things like with his wife and his fan base. Like the fan base wasn't happy that she was modeling some stuff of I think it's her clothing line, using like the stadium and the St Pauli like kind of like as a backdrop, and they felt used, and little things like that. Like if you are a team that needs to punch above its weight to be successful, like those little things, these frictions can really hurt you. And then there's also a lot of criticism at the moment towards Blessin and his match selection and the squad selection, the way that he's trying to play a certain style of football. There's a lot of people within fans, within the fan groups, that believe that maybe he doesn't have the right personnel to play the football that he wants to play. This progressive type of football that got him the job in the first place, because like he replaced Fabian Hürzeler, right? So I think there's a couple like these underlying currents that are going on. And if your club is a little bit in turmoil, then where everything went right last year, it's kind of going off a little bit. Having said all of that, they didn't have the best start last year either, and kind of had to work their way into the season. So this could also just be a matter of like, they always have a big turnover in players. He's trying to work new players into the squad. They're not in a relegation spot despite everything. That's because there's so many other teams that have been more crap. Including Gladbach, who beat them comprehensively in this match day, and that is a concern. But I think when it comes to all of these things, they have to kind of control what's going on off the pitch, and Blessin has to be able to like install the system he wants to play. And if that kind of leads to friction, that can be something that then you start doubting yourself, you start rotating, and then of course the results get even worse.
Yeah, well, that's actually an interesting point you raised there about how they did last season. Obviously, that was Blessin taking over for a head coach who he replaced, and had to kind of really grab the reins around a squad that he inherited, and then try to play a certain way. And I was at the Hamburg derby at the start of the season, and I watched St Pauli play Haas fall off the pitch, and I wrote after the game, I thought, oh, this is the kind of St Pauli 2.0. First season Blessin kind of has to kind of put out fires, do the basics properly, avoid relegation. But now we're going to see Blessin play the football that he wants to play. And that hasn't really happened, obviously, because they've kind of had some real struggles there. But I think the kind of issue, and to a large extent, is in what has kind of proved to be the long-term issues that have kind of still crept into the squad, is that he's ultimately having to rebuild all over again because the players they've lost in the summer, and they've lost so many big players. Philip Trieu, the right back, obviously left for Freiburg, who was a huge player for them. I wrote in the summer that a really great signing for Freiburg. Morgan Giavogi, top goal scorer, heads back to Ligue 1. Elias Sad moves to Augsburg. Johannes Eggestein, who I know maybe not the biggest player, but a really important player, heads to Austria. That's 3 of the top 5 players for goals and assists last season. The other one is Jackson Irvine, who, as you said, having big issue with the fan base, members of the board kind of coming out publicly criticising him, not to mention the fact that he's had to deal with injuries as well, which he's only just kind of returning from. But he was probably one of their best playmakers, if you want to kind of put it that way, last season. And fundamentally, I do think for St Pauli and Blessin, that attack just isn't really working. We saw that in this game where Blessin pulled off the front 3 at half-time. Players he brings on didn't really quite work out, but we're talking about guys like Untonji, who was kind of brought in, who I thought actually had a really good game against Haas Fall, if I'm not mistaken, but it hasn't really quite worked out for him. I'm just kind of looking at the players that have come in and out of that team, and there's a lot of kind of back and forth. There's a lot of injuries. There's a lot of players benched. Blessin isn't happy with that. And I think also what's interesting is that if you kind of look through what Blessin's been saying in press conferences, and I think you can maybe question whether it's the smartest thing to do, to be honest with you, but he has been quite outspoken about the players who aren't performing for him. He's saying things like some players aren't used to closing down and gegenpressing and tracking like the way that they should be doing, which is maybe not an entirely subtle dig at the players that have been brought in. And it kind of feels like maybe there's a lot of frustration from Blessing about the squad that he has to work with right now, to the point that it's kind of bubbling over into the surface. And then you add the whole thing with Jackson Irving in that as well. And it feels like there's quite a lot of tension between the playing squads and either the manager or the club itself. And not to mention, this is a club that's already incredibly passionate to begin with, you know. So I guess we'll just have to see, Manu, whether they can fix all that this season before anything kind of drastic happens. Because as you said, despite the fact that they've lost 6 games already this season, they're still not in the bottom 3, you know, which is absolutely mental. Heidenheim, Mainz, and Gladbach are obviously below them, but we have to kind of wait and see whether Gladbach can get their own shit together, which, despite winning this game, I'm still not entirely convinced by. I think I said on last week's show, the week before, it feels to be like Heidenheim have kind of ran the race in the Bundesliga. Frank Schmidt's maybe kind of running out of ideas, which, by the way, itself was already a kind of like incredible story. And, you know, we can't expect Heidenheim just to stay in the Bundesliga forevermore. And of course, Mainz, who have been struggling as well, who we did have a question about how Mainz are doing as well. And, you know, they're just trying to adapt to a life without Burkhardt and a number of other issues as well. So I think maybe we're seeing a lot of kind of maybe question marks, and, you know, the club have kind of, I don't know if they said officially or maybe unofficially, the reporter is that Blessing's still safe in his position. There's obviously going to be a lot of tension there if the clubs like Gladbach, Mainz, Heidenheim, Augsburg do kind of turn things around. But as things stand, you know, Haasval obviously lost as well today, which means they've only got 1 win in 5. There's a lot of clubs down there that could definitely get relegated. And as things stand, St Pauli are still kind of okay. And amongst all those clubs there, they're one of the few clubs who have kind of gone through this already with Blessing. So you'd think they would give him the kind of time and patience to kind of make sure he can kind of turn things around again this season.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, you know, I also remember they actually paid quite a lot of money to get him too. You know, for their standards. And at the same time too, you know, if you St. Pauli, they're like one of those top 20 clubs, 25 clubs in German football. That does mean that every once in a while you have to also go down. It's just, you know, size of club that you are, unless you like try to emulate what Union Berlin have maybe done in Berlin. But I think that's hard, especially with HSV now being back in the Bundesliga.
Absolutely. Well, should we move on to the final game then, which of course was the top spiel. Very little, very few top, not much top about it, shall we say. From a neutral's point of view, Bayern fans certainly enjoyed it. 2 or 3 questions here about Bayern, and then 1 or 2 that I think are kind of, well, one's directly about Leverkusen, one's about Leverkusen, which we'll touch on. But let's do Bayern first, Manu. There's probably a lot of Bayern fans who've been listening to the show, waiting for us to touch on them. First question is Matthew saying, do we still worry about Bayern's depth after yesterday's performance? And a question that's very similar to that from Aditya, who says, will Bayern be dipping into the January transfer window for reinforcements if they stay as they are right now? What positions do Bayern likely need to strengthen? And he goes on to say, where are Bayern truly placed among the potential Champions League winners across Europe this season? There's no doubt that they're playing well in the Bundesliga. But, you know, what will approach and perhaps results against PSG and Arsenal tells about them at this stage of the season. Hard to say after this game, Manu, which they won at a canter with their B team, but a lot of people may be questioning whether, or not questioning people like us who questioned, well, Beef specifically, who questioned Bayern's strength and depth, and where they can go. What does this mean about them going into the second half of the season, I suppose?
I mean, we question Bayern's strength and depth without knowing how massive of a talent Leonard Karl was going to be. I think he fixes a lot of their problems, and, you know, to Bayern Munich's credit, they probably knew that, or hoped that. You can never be 100% sure when it comes to young prospects like that. But I think, you know, I spent 4 weeks in Munich and talked to a lot of people there, and it sounded like all of this was very much done by design, right? And that is something that doesn't really come out until it works, because if it doesn't work, then they go out and fix it. But now that it is working, they're like, yeah, well, we always try to do it this way, and fair enough. I think the emergence of someone like Leonard Carl is a huge help, and I think the fact that in Wisdom Mike there's another talent just around the corner, that can also probably step up pretty soon and play. And company's willingness to play players. Tom Bischoff is another one we need to mention. His assist, as bad as the defending of that Leverkusen was there, that his assist was brilliant. And he's showing that he can play left back, central midfield, offensive midfield. Like, he's a very, very, very good player in many different positions. And I think that gives Vinny Kompany a lot more options than we thought. And we have to remember, like, Jamal Musiala and Alphonso Davies are running. They're back in running practice. We're talking weeks now, not months, that they're back. That's two world class players coming back. Ito is coming back as well. So I think the depth. I think their concern was that they would be too deep. That they, the rotation, they wouldn't be able to give all the star players the playing time. And right now they're injury free as well. So, that game like the one against Leverkusen helped them. We have to touch on that Leverkusen performance, because I thought that was absolutely atrocious and let Bayern get away with a few things here. And I'm sure there's some questions about it. But, at the moment, I think there's no issues with Bayern Munich's depth. And I don't, they had their financial numbers were released today. It was an increase in finances again, 978 billion euros, I think, just from the soccer or football.
Million, not billion.
Million, million. But they are. I think the entire operation is over €1 billion again. If you add the basketball, right, which is increasingly becoming bigger, especially with the new arena in Munich. So they're making more money, but they're increasing the volume of the company. But at the same time, the operational income was less this year than it was last year, and that is with the Club World Cup in mind. And that's the big part of that is contract renewals. And Dresden did say we will only spend what we'll earn, right? So if you're a Bayern Munich fan waiting for big January transfers at the moment, especially with the way the squad is going, don't hold your breath. I don't think anything is going to happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. Obviously, German clubs in general, but specifically Bayern, don't tend to go out in January and spend a lot of money. I think the last January transfer they made was maybe Sasha Boy, which I'm not entirely sure that was one that worked out very well.
That was a panic buy.
Yeah, it was. And yeah, I think you make some great points. There's a lot of talk about their the strength and depth this season. Harry Kane kind of came out in pre-season, said this is probably the smallest squad he's played in. But they certainly showed that they're capable of competing at least at the Bundesliga level. That is the B team, if you will. The players who kind of stepped up were the players who would be sitting on the bench. Your Jackson's at centre forward. Tom Bischoff, who I want to touch on in a moment, Leonard Carl, not Leonard Carl, Leonard Carl definitely, but Konrad Leimer as well. These are all players who, if in a full squad, fully fit squad, maybe wouldn't be getting game time, except maybe Konrad Leimer at right back. So it's definitely a testament to Bayern, to Vincent Kompany, that all these players are desperate to play and they all want to play when they do get game time, and they certainly did their job on Saturday. So I think that's a very, very commendable thing, and I think it's something that Bayern fans should be very excited about. Leonard Carl, if he continues to do what he's doing right now, Manu, in the comparisons to Musiala are too kind of delicious to avoid. It's a very exciting time for Bayern Munich. I do want to touch on Tom Bischoff actually, though, because watching him at left back against Leverkusen, we've seen him do it already this season. I was kind of thinking it's almost like he's getting this kind of scholarship or apprenticeship at Bayern on how to be the next kind of Joshua Kimmich in a very kind of real sense, in a way like, we know you're a good central midfielder, but we want you to actually also prove that you can be a great fullback as well, so we can rely on you. And I find it so fascinating because I didn't think he's been great defensively at fullback. Not that he was tested in this game by any means, but in recent games we've seen him at fullback. I don't think he was outstanding. But as we saw with that goal that he set up, he's in tremendous passer with the ball. And that's obviously one of the great things about Kimmich when he plays at right back. He can play almost as this de facto kind of playmaker. And when we saw Bischoff play there, it meant that they had someone out there who can obviously pick passes out as well and help Bayern control the game. But it is interesting having just gone through the last kind of 5 or 8 years or something of watching Joshua Kimmich play centre mid, play right back, centre mid, right back for club and country, and everyone debating what his best position is, and the monotonous nature of that, and the question marks over whether he's really going to fulfill his potential because he's always having to fill in the right back. And I find it fascinating that Bayern are just quite content to do that with Tom Bischoff at left back. Now, I know he's just helping out and he's playing that team, but I mean, Guerrero was in that team. He's in a starting 11 and Bischoff's still playing left back. And, you know, I'm sure when Alphonso Davies comes back, he'll be fit and do very well, and Bischoff will have kind of slot back in as a kind of backup in the centre mid positions. But I just think it's a fascinating thing for a company to do from a kind of player development role. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It might do him some real good playing in those positions, because I'm sure Kimmich has certainly benefited from playing in defence and learning what he has to do in that regard. And I don't think anyone could really fault Kimmich's commitment to Bayern and his performances both as centre mid and right back. Yeah. So if Bischoff does develop into this Bayern player over the next kind of 5 or 10 years who can play left back as well as he can play centre mid, then I'm sure that'll be a real asset to Bayern. But it's a fascinating thing to watch play out in real time this season.
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating. I also wonder if company is just laughing at us a little bit here, because like he plays Bischoff at left back and Guerrero, as they said, as a number 10, where like in reality, like those two positions should have probably been reversed, right? But I think at times, like the way Bayern play, it's almost positionless. Yeah, Bischoff, like for that pass, and like the pass of the Gnabry goal, that was excellent. I mean, Gnabry has been fantastic, period, this season. He was playing as a left back in that situation, right? Like, I mean, he was not just on paper a left back, he was on the field as a left back there. And, but I do wonder if like him playing different positions, if going forward that allows company football sort of like players to just rotate positions, right? Because at times it did look like a backstreet as well, where Bischoff was almost joining the two midfield, Goretzka and Kimmich. And you see that with Kimmich often too, when he plays right back, he will drift into the middle. And in fact, you actually see it also when he plays center mid, that he will drift back to the right and help out defensively there as well, right? So it could be just a lesson of like, yeah, you need to be able to play multiple positions so that we can use you on the field in different situations, and that we are harder to play against. I mean, you saw the same with Guerrero, would like drifted out wide, and then Karl would go in the middle, because like Karl is I think more content playing in the center position, right? So I think this is just a learning mechanism. But you know what? Like people were complaining that the young kids are not playing, and this is like the second time in a row now that these guys are all starting. They're getting Champions League minutes. They're getting like Karl's minutes are probably now just as many as Jamal Musiala at the same age. So. Yeah, can't really complain about that.
No. Well, before we wrap up, there's obviously a few more questions I want to touch on. Mostly about Leverkusen, but also just a general Bundesliga point, which I think is important. Russell asks, where did Leverkusen go from here? And then Adam asks, why do so many Bundesliga teams view going to Bayern as something to survive and move past, rather than an opportunity to bring their A game and test themselves against the best? Now, this is something we were kind of debating in our WhatsApp chat with the guys who help run this podcast and the newsletter with us. And it's an interesting question, Manu, because, I mean, we can kind of break it apart if we want. Leverkusen were shit because Leverkusen are shit this season. And they've obviously, brought a new head coach who's in Rasmus Yeoman, who's still trying to kind of get to terms with a squad that he didn't build, and inherited a team from Erik ten Hag that was probably all over the place. Leverkusen are absolutely a team in transition, team full of potential for sure, but just not capable of going to the Allianz Arena and causing an upset by any means at this point. But
yeah,
well, let's do that first. Let's do Leverkusen first.
I was never more disappointed about a team's performance at the Allianz Arena than this one. I was worried about how Dortmund would play, and the first 30 minutes was very worrying, and then in the second half they really turned it on, and that was a really good game. I don't think anyone would have complained if Leverkusen had lost 2-1 at the Allianz Arena after a battle. Like top teams, the best.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, but like if Leverkusen had put in the same performance and lost.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
Yeah. And some of the best teams in the world go to the Allianz Arena and get smashed, right? That's just the reality of it. But I mean, the only reason this result wasn't higher is because Bayern Munich let Leverkusen live. This is just a fact. And Leverkusen went into this match, and I mean, they looked scared. They looked like a bunch of kids facing man, and they just looked absolutely scared. They looked like they were out of depth. They didn't have any composure whatsoever. It's actually, as this game I watched this game in the States, and it was on main television here, and it was hyped up and all that, and the Bundesliga did like a big DFL house in New York and all that sort of stuff. And then one of those two teams shows up like this. It's embarrassing. I thought it was an absolutely embarrassing performance. And if I was Simon Rolfes, I'd be going into the dressing room and give them the hairdryer treatment, because like it's okay to lose there. Again, I that's fine. But the way this team got dismantled in 45 minutes by Bayern Munich's B team in front of a million people audience in the United States and other key markets puts the league into a bad light. And as a member, like you as Bayer Leverkusen are one of the 18 members of that league that's trying to sell this product abroad. And like, if you're not up to playing at this level, then this is maybe not the right job for you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think I said at full time. No, I said at halftime. We're at halftime in the Allianz Arena, and Bayern's B team are beating Liverpool's feeder club comfortably. And like obviously a few people had a lot of jokes about it, but I said, look, I love German football. We don't do this podcast to pay the bills. We do this podcast because we love German football. We love talking about it. It's just out of a sheer love for the football. I know we have subscriptions and people pay us and stuff, but that's to keep the thing going. But we don't do this out of anything but our love for German football. And a game like that one, I was so dejected at halftime. And I know there'll be Bayern fans listening and watching and being like, oh, but that's because you hate Bayern Munich. And it's not because of that by any means. I definitely don't hate Bayern Munich. And I support Bayern Munich in the Bundesliga, in the Champions League, when they're playing teams from England or Spain or Italy or whatever. But I get so dejected when, as you said, teams, and as Adam has quite asked him that question, why teams just don't even try. They show up to the Bayern Munich and they think it's a bye. They can just, it's a dead rubber. They don't have to try. And it comes across as if there's no expectation or pressure on these teams to perform. It'd be one thing if it was Augsburg or St Pauli. In fact, St Pauli put up a much better fight. So did Augsburg actually this season already.
Yep.
But if one of these kind of minnows, with all due respect, really struggled at the Allianz Arena, you'd understand. But a club of Leverkusen's resources and a club of Leverkusen's kind of history and the people at the club, they should be doing better. And I think there's two things at hand here. Number one is the economics of European football, which means clubs like Leverkusen just get completely pulled apart every summer. We've seen it with Leverkusen, we've seen it with Frankfurt, we've seen it with Stuttgart this summer. I think a lot of German clubs will say, well, there's not much we can do. There's so much money in England and Saudi Arabia and at Real Madrid and Barcelona, and that's true. But I think a lot of them hide behind that excuse because I think a lot of them like making money. And I think clubs like Leverkusen, Frankfurt and Stuttgart know, well, maybe not Stuttgart as much, but definitely Frankfurt and Leverkusen know we can make 150 million euros in the transfer market every year, and it's not going to seriously jeopardise our standing in the league. And their standing in the league is anywhere between second place and 10th place. Now, obviously, if Leverkusen finish 10th, it's not a great season, but it's not the end of the world for them. And I think that's a major issue, which is obviously and Leverkusen have essentially opted to sell their best players and just have an off-season where they try and rebuild. And there's a lot of clubs that are doing that as well. Leipzig are doing that this season, Frankfurt did this season, Stuttgart to an extent as well. Maybe not Stuttgart as much, but definitely Leverkusen. And I think those clubs are allowed to do that. And I don't just mean sell players, but also give themselves an off-season to rebuild with the 10 young players they've signed from French and Belgium every year, because there's no culture of winning at these clubs. And I think this is a serious issue, because if I went to speak to people, and I didn't bother doing this because I know I'd probably just get shouted at, but if I went to speak to someone at Leverkusen after yesterday's game and said, what the hell's going on there? I'd just get told to F off, because they'd say, it's not our job to challenge Bayern Munich. It's not our job to go to the Allianz Arena and win. It's not our job to challenge the league title every year. But the problem is, the people at Leverkusen are saying that, and the people at Frankfurt are saying that, and the people at Dortmund say that as often as they possibly can. And even the people at Leipzig are saying that as well. And the problem is, if nobody's willing to step up and say it's our job to challenge Bayern, nobody challenges Bayern. And it seeps into the culture of these clubs. And yeah, you can have a head coach who can step in from time to time and say, no, I want to win something, like a Klopp, like a Nagelsmann. Maybe a Sebastian Hoeneß or a Kovac might step in. So maybe even Timo Werner might say, I'm not just here to develop the kids, I want to win something. So special things can happen. But I just think if one of us was to sit here with Simon Rolfes or Castro or, Sebastian Kehl or whoever else and say, why does this keep happening? They would say, well, it's not our job to challenge Bayern. So, and that's that.
And I mean, the flip side of that is I often ask the people at Bayern Munich, like, isn't it a problem that your league isn't competitive? And they will say, like, well, that's not our problem. We're not going to stop winning games. Like, our job is to win every single game. Like, our ambition is to be the best team in the world. Like, it says it in their anthem.
Yeah.
Like, it's up to Dortmund and Frankfurt and, like, Leverkusen and Stuttgart. Like, we want them to challenge us. Like, in fact, we would welcome it. But we can't just give them money and tell them to challenge us. Like that, this is not how this works. Like that. So you have one club that is ultra competitive, and you have a bunch of teams that are not, and that's a cult. I said this in the chat. I actually think that's a cultural problem.
Yeah, of course it is. Another thing as well, Manu, is it's a very lucrative gig to be the second or third biggest team in Germany.
Yeah,
Dortmund make a fortune every year. Frankfurt make a fortune every year. These clubs are in the, Forbes top 20 most valuable clubs in the world, and the biggest revenues are Dortmund.
And they make profits too. Like unlike the Premier League teams, like the profit margins are enormous. Like
so if you're a shareholder at Dortmund or at Frankfurt or anything, things couldn't be better. You don't need to win the league. You don't need to win the Bundesliga to get your dividends every year, or to to make profits and stick it in the bank every year. And I think that's an issue too, in the sense that I just keep coming back to this idea that these clubs are too comfortable. Frankfurt can have an off-season. Leverkusen can have an off-season. Now, I know people will be saying, well, Leverkusen sacked their head coach. They didn't sack Ten Hag because he'd lost 2 or 3 games. They sacked him because they realised very on this wasn't going to work. Behind closed doors, personality-wise, issue with players and squads and the recruitment. That's why Ten Hag was sacked. He wasn't sacked because they might finish 5th or 6th this year, because they probably will finish 5th or 6th, and it won't really make a difference. And I do think that's the issue. At Bayern Munich, 6 failures just not accepted. At Frankfurt, at Leverkusen, at Leipzig, and maybe to a slightly less extent at Dortmund, because I know Dortmund have to finish the top 4 every year. But for the most part, these clubs are comfortable where they are. They're far too comfortable from a financial point of view to actually need to succeed, to actually need to. If Frankfurt or Dortmund could only register a profit every year by winning the Bundesliga and, say, getting into the Champions League, these clubs would be going hell for leather to challenge Bayern. And, Leverkusen would be walking onto the pitch at the Allianz Arena to fight tooth and nail for every inch, every blade of grass. But it's just not there. And, I guess I'm just in full rant mode, and we probably do have to wrap this podcast up. But I don't know. It was a very frustrating game, and it kind of brought out all these things that I love German football, but it's definitely a thing that pisses me off about it.
I do unfortunately think it's a cultural thing. Like when you're in Munich and you see how ambitious that city is. You saw it with like the Olympic application, right? Like they're like, we want to host the Olympics, and therefore we're going to ask the people whether they're going to want it, and they got it done within weeks, right? And whereas like the other places in Germany that want to apply, they're still trying to get the act together. And Berlin, for example, doesn't even know what they're doing yet. And so I think it's just a cultural thing. Like things just get done faster, better, and bigger in Bavaria than in the rest of the country. And so like I do actually unfortunately think, and I know the rest of Germany always kind of like is mad about it, or like is upset about it, or like looks down on Bavaria or is jealous of Bavaria because things are usually better there. But that's because there's more ambition there. And like sometimes it fails spectacularly and sometimes it sounds hilarious, but like there's a reason Bayern Munich play in Bavaria and are successful, right? I think it's actually fundamentally a cultural thing. And that's not going to change. For that to change, you need to have like teams that have, like Frankfurt are the only team in the state of Hesse. Stuttgart, like, Baden-Württemberg is almost as rich as Bavaria. Like Stuttgart has the ability to emulate or copy what Bayern Munich have done in Bavaria. Like Hamburg should not be a team that's just come back from the second division after 7 years. Like considering the money that's available there. So like it is a cultural problem, unfortunately. And that's not going to change until, like maybe the incentives need to be different.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. And maybe these clubs should be as comfortable financially, but
yeah.
Anyway, we're not going to solve that today, but I think I think that sums up our frustration with that game, didn't it?
I do think the Leverkusen performance was shocking. And I said it before the season that, I named them as my biggest flop of the year. And I thought, maybe I'm wrong with Hjulmand now being appointed. And I do think Hjulmand is the right coach, but I think my flop of the year prediction is going to be spot on.
Yeah. I mean, even like, not to kind of take it back up because we do need to wrap up, but Leverkusen is a good example of, yes, they won the league title. And people will be saying, oh, well, why are you guys giving Leverkusen grief? They're the last team to challenge the league title. They challenged for the league title because they had an exceptional head coach in Xabi Alonso who made the club sign his players. And he was able to put together a squad of ready-made stars like Grimaldo, like Granit Xhaka, and there's a bunch of other ones I can't even think about, to be honest. But every summer they signed, when he was there, they signed his players. Jonas Hoffmann's another one as well, actually, I think. And when he moved on, as we reported on this podcast, people at Leverkusen told me we can go back to the way we've done things before. That is signing young players, developing them, making lots of money, and doing the same thing again. And you have to kind of question at what point is any of this actually any use to fans of the club specifically or the league itself, because there's so many clubs that are they're just kind of like finishing schools for footballers as opposed to actual sporting organizations that want to win trophies and medals, Anyway, maybe that's a good way to wrap it up, man.
Let's wrap this up. We'll be back with Champions League content throughout the week. I'm traveling, so it might be different times, but it will be all in your inbox as per usual. All right, Stefan. Until next time. Auf Wiedersehen.